was like, you know, doing stuff that was impossible minutes before, and that's when it dawned on me that, you know, this is medicine.
Tonight, the Liberal government wants cannabis to be legal this summer. The issue has caused lots of debate, but we meet one couple who says cannabis turned their life around.
It's very stressful, not knowing week to week if the center is going to stay open.
And a well-loved friendship center in Winnipeg has its funding cut off again. Good evening, I'm Brittany Hobson. It was 1 year ago today when 14-year-old Josiah Begg was found dead in Thunder Bay's McIntyre River. The teenager had been missing for nearly 2 weeks after coming to the city for medical appointments. Josiah's family traveled from Kanichame-Kusib in Innuag to hold a memorial in Thunder Bay today. Community members gathered with the family at the spot where he was found by police last year. One of Josiah's grandfathers, Mike McKay, said while the family still has a lot of questions about his death, they're here for healing and to remember Josiah.
He liked to hunt. I think that's one of the key, the highlights or the key points of his life was he liked to hunt, and he was also very close to his family, like his brothers and sisters, and he's very close to them. It helps. It helps us as part of our recovery, our journey.
One of the country's oldest, largest, and most embattled friendship centers in Canada is facing problems again. Its funding has been suspended, and it's not the first time. Melissa Ridgen has the story.
The Indian and Métis Friendship Centre in Winnipeg's North End sees a reported 7,000 people through the doors each month, doors that could close as a result of its funding being cut off by the Manitoba Association of Friendship Centres.
It's very stressful, not knowing week to week if the center is going to stay open.
It's the second time in as many years the IMFC has been sanctioned for not reporting properly to MAC, which administers funding to 11 friendship centres in Manitoba. They were recently reinstated and got money in March for the first time since 2016. But in April, they were told they're being cut off again.
MAC was happy with it, but up to now, things have changed since the old executive director, the board decided not to renew his contract, and the finance lady decided that it was too much for her. I don't blame her for leaving, and it is a lot on a person.
That's the problem, says Mac. Those two people were keeping the books in order, and now they're in disarray again. Who took over?
The interim executive director at the IMFC.
And you're on the board as well, board president?
Board president up to now.
Last year, American Indian Movement supporters elected him president. Shortly thereafter, 6 of the 9 people elected to the board were kicked off, and then went the executive director. MAC President Roberta McKinnon says none of this is allowed.
We've told IMFC many times, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it, this is what we expect, and they're just not following what we're asking.
On top of this, not everyone has submitted their criminal record checks as required.
When you're not behaving or not being responsible for your financials and your governance, it paints a bad brush for the rest of the centers.
Lajamodier says the board has asked for training but was denied.
We have reached out to help them. We have asked them to have governance training and board training and how to take minutes. We've asked them, let us know when your board meetings are so we can come and observe and help you. And they haven't let us know.
He says someone needs to intervene in the dispute.
We need the help from the federal government and the provincial government to come in here and see who's really in the wrong.
Melissa Ridgen, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
APTN has reported on many cannabis discussions happening on Parliament Hill and in the Senate. Tonight, medical cannabis activist Ian Campeau and his wife Justine share their story. Here's Annette Francis.
Justine Campeau enjoys spending time in her garden.
See, we've got some big ones.
But you know what? The skinny ones have good flavor.
She and her husband Ian moved to this farm an hour outside of Ottawa 3 years ago. After a life-altering experience, Justine aspired to be closer to the land.
So I was 25 and I was breastfeeding my baby and I found a lump, and it turned out to be stage 3 breast cancer, and which is pretty spooky. I didn't have any gene mutation or any real indication. They don't really know why I got it, and it was intense.
Justine had to fight for her life. After a mastectomy, she was left to deal with nerve damage and pain.
My doctors gave me all kinds of pills, and some of them were really scary. We went through a lot, trying all of them, and in the end it ended up being a really intense opiate that I used, which was just ruining my happiness being on it. It makes you like a wet blanket, and the pain's not there, but you're dizzy and you're sleepy. And
it was also a traumatic time for Ian, as he was touring a lot with a tribe called Red. That's when he turned to cannabis.
At the end of that really stressful year, I asked her if it was okay if I just didn't stress out and just relaxed and tried some cannabis and watched something funny on TV and eat some cereal and go to bed. Was kind of what I wanted to do and not be stressed out.
After seeing what it did for him, he introduced cannabis to his wife. He's since become an advocate.
I'll compare it to somebody standing up out of a wheelchair almost. She was moving her arm, she was touching it, she was doing stuff that was impossible minutes before, and that's when it dawned on me that this is medicine.
They're both legal medical cannabis patients now. Justine says she no longer relies on opioids.
Well, I use it in every possible way. I always have it on topically. I have a dropper that I use every morning of CBD, and then throughout the day I vaporize, shatter mostly, and that keeps me good.
Justine says she applied for a Health Canada license, and if all goes well, she'll grow her own cannabis. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Perth, Ontario.
The battle continues over the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline, with shots being fired from the federal government and the Alberta government. The Alberta government made good on their promise to make British Columbia pay for their court challenge against the pipeline by passing a bill that could inflict financial pain on BC. APTN's Tina House has more on this story.
Earlier this week, Premier Rachel Notley announced her government would be passing Bill 12.
If the path forward for the pipeline through BC is not settled soon, I am ready and prepared to turn off the taps.
Bill 12 will allow the Alberta government to limit its resources to BC, and that could add up to a massive price jump at the pumps. With Vancouver already paying the highest gas prices in North America, the current price is at $1.62 per litre. Experts predict that number could skyrocket to $2 per litre by the summer. Eugene Kung is a lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law. He says Bill 12 is controversial.
So what we have in Bill 12 is the province of Alberta doing something pretty similar to what they accused BC of doing a couple months ago, which is passing a law that would restrict the flow of oil products, and particularly diluted bitumen. I think it's a little ironic that the same province that's trying to increase the flow of oil is using the threat to shut it off or to restrict it as a hammer, as a tool.
The battle also continues in the courtroom, where government lawyers have proposed that the First Nations fighting against the pipeline should be paying for their own legal expenses, including the Coldwater First Nation in BC, where the original pipeline runs near that reserve. Chief Lise Pahan was in Vancouver and says he isn't surprised at their latest move.
It seems like they'll do anything for the pipeline, and that's concerning.
With Kinder Morgan's May 31st deadline quickly approaching, the federal government announced it would be open to offering an indemnity to finish the project if Kinder Morgan bails out. And here on the front lines, where land defenders are preparing for another rally against Kinder Morgan, Kat Roivas has a message for Prime Minister Trudeau.
So at this moment in time, an multinational oil company based in Texas is telling a sovereign nation what to do.
Tina House, APTN National News, Burnaby.
Time for a quick break, then we'll continue our look at the effects of ecological grief on those fighting development projects. Here's a look at Saturday's weather forecast starting on the sunny east coast, 15 above in Halifax and Charlottetown. Sun and -1 in Nain, +7 in La Grande. Rain for parts of Quebec, +15 in Montreal, +17 in Saint-Jovie, +15 in Ottawa. Cloudy skies and 19 above in London and Windsor. A sunny +14 in Sioux Lookout. 16 above in Big Trout Lake in northern Manitoba, +19 and under the sun in Flin Flon and the Pas. Sun continues in southern Manitoba, +18 in Dauphin, Brandon and Winnipeg. In Saskatchewan, clear skies and 18 above in Yorkton and Regina, +20 in Meadow Lake and Buffalo Narrows. Research out of Labrador says Indigenous people facing the loss of their land, water, or way of life often experience grief. In part 2 of this feature story on ecological grief, APTN's Justine looks at how the RCMP, government, and corporations deal with those who turn that grief into action.
Marjorie Flowers doesn't consider herself a criminal. But in 2017, she found herself in a maximum security men's prison, far away from her family, community, and land.
Well, he put the handcuffs on, and then he chained those handcuffs to around my waist, so my hands couldn't move, like it was around my waist hard. And then there was a chain that went down and connected to the ankle cuffs.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Her crime? Refusing to promise a judge she'd stay away from Muskrat Falls, where she and dozens of others occupied the hydro dam site in 2016.
We were this little group of people with an idea that we wanted to save our land, that we wanted to save my food that I put on my table and eat it, and depend on that.
Facing the loss of traditional foods and a river that has given them life, they united in grief. A grief that Ashley Consolo has researched.
You know, I saw many moments where people would be talking about history or culture or past and would get really emotional, and those around them would comfort them. And that's a very different form of collective resistance or protests. And it's a very different response than I think people generally think of when they think of protesters, or they want people to be angry somehow. But when people come together to share in grief and to share in strength related to that grief, that is a moving, profound, unstoppable force.
Consolo calls it ecological grief. She says it can be felt when anticipating the loss of ancestral lands or traditional foods.
And then the response related to that through emotional and psychological impacts to your lives and to individual and collective lives.
She says grief isn't considered when Indigenous people are defending their land.
I don't think that we necessarily know how to deal with that in media, in court injunctions, in the legal system, in mitigation and adaptation strategies, in policy.
Flowers knows this feeling firsthand.
We couldn't even breathe. I felt like I was losing my breath because of all this, the power from the outside, from the colonialism, government, the corporation itself, the law enforcers.
Mark Grucci, a lawyer representing Flowers and other land protectors, says the court injunctions granted to Nalcor Energy, the Crown Corporation building the dam, shouldn't have happened in the first place.
These are Indigenous people, for the most part, who feel very morally justified in what they're doing, and in fact felt compelled in many instances to be involved in this issue the way they were. You have the normal operation of the justice system colliding with a very social, complex issue, which ought to be dealt with on a political level and never should have got here.
Ryerson criminology professor Shiri Pasternak says injunctions are increasingly used by corporations to deal with Indigenous people who resist the destruction of their lands.
In order to justify, in order to authorize the RCMP and police forces to enforce the Canadian and these companies' access to Indigenous lands. They need to secure kind of legal authority, and they do that through the injunction. And more and more injunctions that are used against Indigenous people are won quite easily.
Jeffrey Monahan, a criminology professor at Carleton University, says Flowers is caught up in something much bigger.
We see a dramatic increase and a rise in terms of national security resources and national security language starting to focus their attention, target, and police Indigenous movements with more and more intensity, and using, again, these kind of language of national security and the resources of national security.
In his new co-authored book, Policing Indigenous Movements, Monahan shows the RCMP, government, and corporations working together to suppress Indigenous protests and movements, at times referring to those defending their lands as extremists.
You have an intensification of surveillance, you have more and more resources, and of course you have a reframing of a local conflict over land, over complex histories being reduced to national security, notions of extremism, and being really reframed as very criminal and violent threats.
All with the goal of protecting corporate profits and Canada's critical infrastructure, he says.
All kinds of different, mostly privately owned forms of property, from pipelines to kind of nuclear facilities to important roadways to dams and all kinds of different forestry roads that gets applied all over the place.
This has become de facto the kind of securitization that is happening behind the scenes, but that you can see materialize when protests erupt and when there's land defense actions.
Pasternak says authorities will surveil, follow, and approach land protectors, a tactic called soft policing that the RCMP and other forces will try first.
So rather than looking like violent repression, they work in more covert and subtle ways in terms of letting people know that they're being watched, in the hopes that people will self-police not to get involved in things because they're intimidated.
From Idle No More to Elsie Buktuk and Muskrat Falls to Kinder Morgan, Monahan and Pasternak agree policing Indigenous movements is about protecting corporate profits.
And I think that Muskrat Falls, if we step back from it and we look at it, at what is its significance in history in this area in Canada, I think that's one of the things that it's teaching us, is if we really look at all the different pieces that happen and we start to tell this complex story, there are key learnings about grief and people coming together in a painful way, but in also a resilient way.
While ecological grief may be driving Flowers to fight, according to Pasternak and Monahan, the interests that threaten her land and way of life are the same ones punishing her.
The government has historically and continually come into our land, into this land, without proper consultation and taken what they wanted without giving anything back.
You heard me! Get up. You heard me!
Instead of defending themselves on the land, in the coming weeks, land protectors will defend themselves in court. Flowers says she will plead not guilty and has no plans to stand down against what she says is still a grave threat to her people's food, safety, and culture. Justin Brake, APTN National News, Halifax.
Nalcor Energy did not grant APTN an interview for this story. The RCMP's new commissioner was not made available by airtime. To watch part 1 of this series, go to aptnnews.ca. That's where you'll also find Justin Brake's full write-up on ecological grief. Designers from across Turtle Island are gearing up for Indigenous Fashion Week in Toronto. We'll meet one of those designers after the break. Here's the rest of Saturday's weather forecast, starting in sunny northern Alberta, plus 23 in Fort McMurray, 25 above in Grand Prairie, 17 under the sun in Calgary and Medicine Hat, a cloudy day on the west coast, plus 19 in Victoria, plus 12 in Port Hardy. Sunny skies and plus 24 in Prince George, 20 above in Dease Lake. In the Yukon, 17 and overcast in Whitehorse, a cooler minus 1 in Rock River. Over to NWT, sun and 23 in Trout Lake, 22 in Wrigley. 4 above in Colville Lake, minus 9 in sun in Sax Harbor. Cooler temperatures in Nunavut, 1 degree in Baker Lake and Chesterfield. Overcast and minus 6 in Johaven, minus 3 in Resolute on Saturday. Indigenous fashion designers from across Turtle Island will meet in Toronto for a week of style, workshops, and markets. And for one Inuvialuit artist, the excitement is growing. Charlotte Morik-Jacobs reports.
A long time ago, somebody said to me, "You'll never get $25 for that tufting." But I remember thinking, you want to bet?
Now, Brendalyn Trenert's work sells for anywhere from $50 to $2,500. The Inuvialuit from Fort Providence goes by her artist name, Anouk 360.
You could see that it went from a bundle to a tuft.
When she first picked up a needle at 21, she set out to be the Louis Vuitton of caribou tufting. Now she is prepping to flaunt her baton at Toronto's inaugural Indigenous Fashion Week.
I'm just a little girl inside this woman body, just freaking out.
This is her first fashion week, and she says she is ready to Anoukify the runway.
My youngest niece sat with me and taught me how to do this type of beading.
She puts her own flair into all of her creations, but breaking into the industry came with challenges.
When galleries tried to tell me what to tuft for how much, change my name to make it sound more Indigenous, it came to a point I put my needles and thread down, and that was it.
Last year, another obstacle. She crushed her hand in an accident. While her hand is still healing, she has persevered by using different textiles.
I work with a lot of cowhide and different leathers, and but now I've been lucky enough to be able to get Fort Liard moose hide, which is when you have the sharp needles, it's just like butter sewing through it. And same with the sealskin, it's lighter on the hands.
As Anouk 360 uses social media to showcase and sell her work, she also plays educator to those with misconceptions around sustainable furs.
We only hunt what we need, and we use everything of the animal. Not enough people, EU included, understand the impact of saying no to us selling the seal skin products. It's devastating to how many people in the higher Arctic.
Anouk 360 says she is mostly looking forward to being with like-minded Indigenous artists and celebrating her culture. Charlotte Morik-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
That's your APTN National News for this Friday. I'm Brittany Hobson. Have a great weekend.